from personal experience that people do not change with that frequency, but certainly daily would be good practice.
Richard, I remember when I used to go into hospitality and I used to talk about protective clothing. And with some people, they thought that the clothes were to protect them from the food, not the other way around. That, you know, oh, I don't want to get my clothes dirty, so I put a chef's coat on. And that still, I think, is for some people. They think it's to keep them clean, not to keep the food clean. So protective clothing is obviously very important. Maybe I should ask you about protective clothing, something that's a bit sensitive, gloves. You know, in the food industry, it's not unusual to find the blue gloves that people are using, food grade, blue so they can be seen very clearly in case something gets lost in some food. Are you pro using gloves or are you anti or ambivalent, Richard?
I think that it's more important to have hand hygiene than wearing gloves. So a lot of people, it worries me a little bit, think, well, if I put gloves on, then I don't need to worry about hand hygiene. So they might wear the gloves all day, cross-contaminating everything, touching things, touching raw food, touching ready-to-eat, high-risk food, and so on. When you touch your face or you do anything that it picks up contamination, the gloves are likely to pick up that contamination even more so than the hands. So it's not, wearing gloves isn't an alternative. If you're going to wear gloves, hand hygiene is just important. So I think that I prefer in most cases to emphasize the importance of regular hand washing than wearing gloves as the solution.
Do you know, I think I agree with that, Richard. I think if you wear gloves, it gives you like a full sense of security. Well, I've done my hygiene bit, I'm protecting the food, and people don't realize there's no difference between contaminating gloves and contaminating hands. And you're quite right, if you get your hands dirty, the natural instinct, especially if you're properly trained, is to go to a wash hand basin. But if you've got gloves, you don't often see people replacing their gloves or washing their gloves. Because there is this mental thing, well, I've done the bit that I need to do. So that's something that resonates with me. As long as you're clean, you know, keeping yourself clean, your hands clean, that's the important thing to avoid contamination. What about face masks then? If you go to most high-risk factories, isn't it? People are not just wearing gloves, but they're wearing the masks as well. Are you pro or against masks?
Well, I think in the main, only in terms of beer snoods and things like that, I don't think there's a need for masks in most businesses. And you don't see that obviously, you don't see that in hospitality. You only see that in manufacturing, that some countries in particular wear masks, whether it's in both to protect the workers from certain foods such as Campylobacter in poultry houses, or whether it's to protect the food from the food handler. I'm not convinced of the need for masks.
Okay, then what about, let's talk about, you mentioned beard snoods and hair coverings. A must in hospitality, if you're a food handler, should you be wearing a beard snood and something to cover your hair so the hair doesn't get in the food?
In most cases, I think that a hat is fine. And again, manufacturers have much stricter controls over foreign body contamination, which is what we're effectively talking about with hair, than hospitality. Most people, unless you're in a cook-chill kitchen or something like that, but if you go to a retail business or a restaurant, then the chances are that the people in the kitchen may wear head covering. A lot of them don't wear hairnets, but in some countries, hairnets are very common amongst all staff. In fact, people tend to think hairnets are more important than protective clothing, you know, like coats and so on, which I do find surprising, because I do think that coats, protective coats, are probably the most important thing in terms of protecting the food. Beer snoods, Having had a beard at one time, I can assure you, beer snoods, I'm not sure whether they work. Two reasons. One is that if you get any hair stuck in it, tends to irritate you and you're likely to scratch. So you lift the snood and scratch your beard is one thing. The other thing is when you take it off, quite often people will put it in the pocket and then put it back on again when they go back in the business. Well, it can pull the hairs out or have hairs in them, and then you put it on the wrong way and you can end up with the hair going in the food. So again, I'm not a big fan of saying that snoods are going to be the answer to the problem.
Yeah, but I suppose the big issue is the sequence that you do it, isn't it, Richard? Is that if you put a hat on, if you're a chef, if you put a hairnet on, then you put your coat on, then that might be okay. But the trouble is, once you start putting your coat on first, then you put your hat on, so the sequence is wrong. The very fact of putting your hat on, or your smood or something, means it's more likely you're going to dislodge hair. And the hair complaints I've seen isn't that the people aren't wearing the protective clothing to protect the food, it's the fact they're putting it on in wrong order. And actually,
exactly.
It would have been wear any. So what about cleaning of clothes then, Richard? Coats, sometimes you see the coats and chef's trousers as almost a source of contamination. I did some work with some swabbing before and found that actually the coats themselves, where people use the sleeves, especially you used to find people coming out the toilets, didn't you? And they go into the toilets with their coats on and their trousers on, and they contaminate them. So it's about the clothing itself, avoiding contamination in the first place. Don't take them in the toilet, isn't it? And then making sure you're cleaning them and changing them regularly. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you've hit across on the most important risk from protective clothing. If somebody said to me, what is the greatest risk to food safety from clothing and protective clothing, I'd say, inverted commas, the chef's trousers. The reason for that is that when you go, as you said, when you go to the toilet, you ask people to take off the protective clothing, but that's in a semi-public area. So people aren't going to take the trousers off in a semi-public area. So what they'll do, they may take an apron off, then they'll go into the toilet. And if those trousers actually touch the floor, which they often do, then they're going to be likely to be contaminated. So when he comes out, how is that person going to ensure that those are covered? Because an apron's not going to work. If they just got a top, that's not going to work. And my view at the moment is the only thing that I can think that works with regard to removing protective clothing before you go into the toilet is to wear something like a white coat that is knee length, that covers everything. So you take that off before you go into the cubicle, you go into the cubicle, come out, wash your hands, etc., put the white coat back on. I think it's the only practical solution, but if you can come up with a better answer to that, I'd be interested.
Yeah, so what you see in food factories is hygiene junctions. So there's a dirty side and a clean side. So if you go into the food factory, you have to put your protective clothing on. Immediately you come through the hygiene junction, you have to take it all off. So the toilet's always on the dirty side. So whenever you go in the toilet, you're actually wearing almost your outside undergear. And then when you go back into the factory across the hygiene junction, obviously then you can put your clothes on, and there are wash hand basins as well. So the concept of a hygiene junction, a dirty side and a clean side, I think is the only effective way that you can separate dirty clothing. And then thinking about the condition of the clothing, Richard, as well, isn't it? Some people wear clothes for a long time and you might get buttons. So I've seen chefs wearing buttons on their sleeves, but good food hygiene handlers' costumes don't have buttons or zips and things that could fall into the food, isn't it? They're designed specifically for food handlers. They in themselves don't become a foreign body. Is that what you see?
I agree. I agree with you. What we were saying for factories, I agree 100%. That works, a hygiene junction. But you can't do that in catering. You can't do that in hospitality. You don't have hygiene junctions. So that's the problem.
You do and you don't. I think it depends on the size of the operation. So I've seen some very big catering operations. I've seen people like British Airways, which I think was the largest catering organisation I've ever been to. And depending on the size, you could see it as a small restaurant maybe, but lots of bigger companies, bigger restaurants do have that capability of just having it's like a bench you put in, and people sit on the bench and take their out, their clean clothing for the factory, go and do their stuff, whatever they're doing, going to an office, going to the toilet, come back on the bench, put their stuff back on and go again, including shoes, because shoes are protective clothing as well, isn't it? If you're not careful, you have to be careful you don't kind of step in something filthy outside and end up bringing it into a food area. I think a change of shoes is always a very good idea. I don't like seeing outside shoes in restaurants. There are specific white shoes you can use, which are more comfortable to use, and obviously you don't have that problem, especially for things like listeria, don't you think, Richard, which are in our normal environment? So it's out there in our gardens, in our fields, and if somebody walks through that environment and brings the listeria into a clean environment, there's a chance then that it could multiply and become a problem.
Yeah, I think certainly in a factory, I agree with you 100%. And in terms of good practice, I agree with you. I don't see listeria being a problem in the hospitality industry, because obviously the food is cooked. And so in a retail industry, that's where you've got your listeria problems. And in a factory, hospitality, it's not a listeria problem, but it is best practice to leave your outdoor shoes, because you could have all sorts of contaminants on and pathogens that were more of an issue in the catering industry, whether that be salmonella or Campylobacter or something like that. So yes, I agree with you. Good practice.
But I even think in catering, Richard, you have ready-to-eat food, don't you? Which is where the problem is with listeria. Obviously, if you're going to cook the food very thoroughly, it's not going to be an issue. But I think with ready-to-eat food, once listeria gets into a food environment, it's extraordinary how it can spread. It can get into drains and then spread all round onto equipment and surfaces. I always know that if you've got ready-to-eat food and certain other foods, listeria is a potential risk that you need to use the right hygiene standards for.
Yeah.
So we could say then that perhaps it doesn't always get the attention it needs, personal protective clothing to protect the food, and sometimes the practices when you do use it aren't good enough. Laundries, how often do you make sure that your coats are being cleaned if you're in a restaurant? What advice do you give?
Well, the advice is that whenever your protective clothing is dirty, like your hands, you have to change it. It's quite interesting. In Dubai, it's a mandatory that everybody has to have 4 changes of clothing, which lasts in effect for a week. So every week you can say almost daily, people need to change the protective clothing, which is interesting, because I'm sure in a lot of business, from personal experience, that people do not change with that frequency, but certainly daily would be good practice. And obviously, and when dirty.
Yeah, the legislation says that you have to have clean clothing, doesn't it?
Yes.
So as long as it's clean, and I think it depends on the environment you work in. And again, if you get a spillage or something over your clothes, or if it's been contaminated by you've been doing some cleaning, which you shouldn't do in protective clothing, you should be having other clothing on for that, then you should be considering changing it immediately. But have a program depending upon the risk about how appropriate it is to clean the food. Do you know, I always think a daily clean is not an unreasonable thing as a minimum. Clean when it's dirty. But most laundry companies will supply that service.
Agreed.
Quite a lot to talk about on personal clothing that you wear in a food environment if you're a food handler.
Yes.
A lot more complicated than it seems on first hand about the standards that you use, and more importantly, the practices that you're using with the clothes. So thank you for your views, Richard. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you've got questions about food protective clothing, do go to the Highfield site, and we'll do our best to answer your questions that you've got there. So thank you for joining us. Thanks, Richard.